Hello and welcome to another video in the series where I take a look at previous games that I have developed, and where I talk a little bit about sort of the design side, the technical side, and also share a bunch of the code for that. So today we're going to be taking a look at this game that I made. This was inspired by a global game jam prompt, like with many of the ones that I've worked on. And so this one was called One Minor Incident. So if we take a look at sort of generally what happens in the game. So we go in, there's a little bit of sort of a cutscene. This was actually some of my very, very early uses of using timeline for making cutscenes. And this was sort of the start of me continually making heavy use of that. So how the game starts off is you're a cleaner and you're told that, okay, the previous shift, there was one minor incident in here, and as you can see, everything looks super, super dirty, and you can see this indication of the amount of dirt levels and all of these containers. So you are equipped with essentially dual barrel cleaning guns. These are obviously, 3D modeling is not my forte, but they are obviously a little bit rough. But you'll notice what happened there is, so on each of the weapons, you'll notice there's sort of this overheating indicator, and you can fire each one independently or fire them together. And so what happens is, at the default, it's very precise, but it's also very slow for cleaning things. And we can see the amount of dirt does go down as we're cleaning stuff, but it's very, very slow. And this sort of slower rate, these barrels, they'll knock it a little bit. So they only can move it a small amount. They impart a fairly minimal physics impulse. So when it overheats, though, at this point, I'm not actually trying to make it fire, but what happens is it just spews out, essentially, a huge amount of the cleaning bubbles. And so getting them to overheat is actually really advantageous for cleaning large areas. So if I want to clean the floor here, by far the fastest way for me to do that is to let it actually go into that sort of overload mode. But, as I'll show in a moment, there is a very intentional downside to that, because those in the overload mode, rather than imparting a small impulse, they impart a huge impulse. And there's so many of them, so you can very easily send things flying off into the distance. They shouldn't ever exit out of the room. The physics settings, I've tweaked them to make sure that they don't. But the idea is okay, well, when that happens, people are inevitably just going to be like, well, I don't need to worry about these sort of barrels. I can just leave them to go wherever. That's the next shift's problem. And so what inevitably most people are likely to do is to go for trying to clean things as quickly as possible. So letting stuff overload, and then doing like of this. So I will share some of the stuff for how I manage the dirt things, but essentially, it was a custom shader built. From memory, I used Amplify Shader Editor for it. This is quite an old sort of project, so it was pre things like shader graph and things like that existing. These days, if I was doing it, I would use URP or HDRP and build stuff with shader graph. And it's not a particularly complex shader. There is essentially a base material for the particular things, and then it applies a dirt material over the top. And so it's pretty hard to actually get rid of all of the dirt because pretty much everything you can see, and you can see there's a couple of little areas behind there. Now, the cleaning bubbles do intentionally have a little bit of essentially penetration of the geometry there so that they can, to a limited extent, be fired through things. So you can get most of the stuff, but you get to a point where you pretty much run out of time to be able to clean everything. But by the end of it, once people have sort of discovered the overload mode, the room's generally going to tend to look like this. It's going to look like an absolute mess with stuff scattered everywhere. And, screen fades out, and you get to do your end of shift report, and intentionally, none of these buttons are tickable apart from the one minor incident. And you're like, okay, cool, end shift, and you're at this point, and you're probably thinking, okay, I'm going to be cleaning another area, but you end up back in the room you were already in. The difference is this time, you need to manufacture stuff. And to do that, you need to supply different levels of things into these. So if you've made the room just an absolute mess, it's very difficult to find the particular things you need. The other thing is if you then decide, okay, well, I'm just not going to clean the room. What happens is the dirtier the room is, the more likely you are to either cough or to drop the containers, which if you're coughing, you can then end up actually delivering the wrong amount of stuff. And so you can see, I'm slowed down with being able to actually deliver stuff because I'm trying to find the particular things, but because I've gone and scattered stuff everywhere, it's really difficult to actually find everything in the time that I need to. Now, I did make sure all of the barrels are properly, like they have unique markers and things like that on them. But the barrels also have a limited amount of supplies. So you very easily can run out if you're not careful, and if you've just really thrown all of the barrels around everywhere like this, it gets incredibly difficult to actually deliver what you need to in time. Oh, and see, I'm already way behind time on this. Like it keeps, because what happens is it's periodically selecting, okay, what thing needs to be manufactured, and then once it's done that, you have a limited time window in which to actually provide all of the ingredients that you need. And if you get it wrong in terms of what ingredients you provide, then that actually messes up the batch. You also kind of intentionally can't tell what is actually in the containers. So, or whether a container is empty, sorry. So if you have really made a mess, then it actually becomes very difficult to be able to actually accomplish what you need to. So this was sort of a very intentional part in terms of with the design of it. I liked the idea of having something where, because part of an inspiration for this was games like Viscera Cleanup Detail, which is a game I absolutely love playing. I love the idea of it as well, of just, a game where you're going in after someone has wreaked havoc in a first-person shooter or some games like of that, and having to clean it up and make it orderly is a lot of fun. And so that was sort of the initial part of the idea for this, of being able to incorporate that. but I wanted to sort of add a twist to that. And so I liked the idea that, okay, you were doing this and you come in and you've been told, yeah, no, there was only one minor incident, it was fine. And you clean up and you discover, okay, well, I could be super careful, but I don't have enough time to feasibly really do this carefully. But if I let these things overpower, then stuff just goes flying around. And, physics aspects in games where you can just send things firing all over the place tend to be a lot of fun. So I figured players were likely to lean into that and just absolutely go all in on making an absolute mess of the place. So having them do that and then having that fun realization of, oh, you now need to go into this workplace and try and actually perform a job there that requires things to be orderly, but actually you've made the place an absolute mess. So that was good. I like that aspect, but again, I wanted to counteract the inevitable. Once people know that, the inevitable behavior is, I'm just gonna not clean it, so that everything's exactly where I need it to be. It's nice and neat. So that's where the mechanics like being able to have the coughing cause spillage and things like of that came in. So let's take a look at some of the code systems for it. And I will zoom in significantly more so that we can actually see things properly. So the cleaning gauntlets, which were the two things you have equipped, these pretty straightforward in terms of the logic for them. They had this concept of the heat building up. That heat indicator, that was something where I wanted to keep it simple. So that heat indicator is actually just UI. So if we go to the prefabs for it and take a look, so it actually has this little UI panel. So because it's just an indicator, it's a solid bar that changes color and grows. So this is actually just an image, and I adjust that image in code. So we can see in terms of what's actually happening here while we're firing, the sound events being kicked off, obviously. Heat gets adjusted, cooling happens out when it's not firing, and then all we end up doing for the UI is we adjust the scale and we do a color loop for actually setting the color correctly. So very straightforward in terms of how the visuals are managed for it. And that's something to keep in mind. Like when you are having, some object in the game that the player is using, whether that's a weapon or a tool or something like of that, you can absolutely use meshes and materials for doing a lot of things, but keep in mind that you can also use UI on that as well and attach things like a world space UI to it, and then that world space UI will move with it, it'll stay anchored with it. It is quite an effective way of doing things, so something to keep in mind. Projectiles being launched, again, all pretty straightforward. They had a launch spread, things like of that. The cleaner was the actual script on them. So in terms of what it did, if it was overheated, they had a different strength versus normal, and they also could penetrate further. So when they were overheated, apart from actually releasing far more frequently, they hit with 10 times the force. Their cleaning strength I did end up keeping the same, but there's just so many more of them is the big thing. But they do have a greater level of penetration, so they can penetrate more objects before they're destroyed. So all of that, it was launched, and this cleaner script handles a lot of the little bits of logic So it keeps track of sort of the force that gets imparted. So when it hits something, it ends up being able to, perform this impact on the cleanable item. So that just adds force in a particular direction. It updates the dirtiness as well based upon the particular strength. So all of that relatively straightforward in terms of what it's needing to be doing there. So that worked quite nicely, and it would just update this max penetration, and once that hit 0, then it would be destroyed. So it meant that in that overheated mode, not only could it hit more things, but it also was actually hitting them with more force. So there was a lot of benefit to it. The cleanable item, because I don't think there's anything more in the gauntlets. No, the cleanable item. So a couple of things that this had. So they had their actual default dirtiness. They had stuff like an attached sprite in some cases. And we had the material property blocks for controlling the shader. So anything that was cleanable got registered with this dirt manager. That was how it kept track of how much stuff was actually left to be cleaned. And the property blocks we used to update this dirtiness flag, and that controlled how much of that dirt texture got blended into the existing texture. So not a lot of stuff that needed to actually happen with it. Again, pretty straightforward. The dirt manager itself, again, didn't really need to do a lot of stuff. So code-wise, there didn't end up needing to be too much code for it. It was largely systems and fairly self-contained, straightforward systems that were put together, and then applying those to the setup. It really was quite straightforward, which was good. So we kept track of the dirt level, things like of that, and this was just a very easy way of doing this, of updating it. Not the most efficient, but given the setup and everything for the game, this was one where efficiency was never really a blocker for it. Performance was never really something that became a problem with it, because it was quite simple visuals, quite simple mechanically, so no real difficulties with that. Our game manager used to do a bunch of stuff, so it had a very basic sort of enum style state machine, though really it was very linear of what phases things were going through. But this was the coughing mechanic that I mentioned that just sat on the game manager. So if there was a certain amount of dirt, then it had a chance to make us actually be coughing. So that worked quite nicely. And so what it would look at is this sort of normalized dirt level, which in terms of where did we get the normalized dirt level from? I believe that was something that was getting updated. Actually, a very good question if I was ever updating that. Pretty sure it was. I did see coughing actually happen. There we go. That's right. So when the phase starts for doing the assembly, it looks at whatever the current dirt is versus what the original maximum was, and then that determines the cough interval. So if you haven't actually created much dirt, or if you clean most of the area, it's going to be coughing very infrequently. Otherwise, it'll be coughing quite frequently. And the actual coughing that would get invoked here. So there's a lot of, in terms of structuring with this, I think there's a lot of things that I put on the game manager that in hindsight I wouldn't. I think a lot of these things I would track the state on the game manager, but have the actual logic for handling things sit on things like the player character, ones like of that. because what would actually happen, I think the interactable actually handled the coughing potentially. So we had our interactable items for checking to pick stuff up. That was straightforward. It would just show a prompt. It would, if the raycast hit something, and you could pick it up. So yeah, so that cough trigger that was here would run this in our interactable checker. Again, structure-wise, not particularly what I would go for these days. I would more set that up so that the coughing is handled separately and communicates sort of the dropping to a specific sort of inventory, an item holding script, rather than having the same script that determines whether it should show a UI prompt and stuff like of that, and being the same one that's managing coughing and all of that. I don't think that was a particularly great setup. So this had a few different things that could happen. It could do a random roll and it could drop it, which would cause it to detach, which didn't do too much. There was no real penalty for that, other than you had to go and pick it back up again. Beyond that, there wasn't any downside. The other thing that could happen is you could have a chance to add too much of the ingredient. So that would look and see, okay, were we looking at one of the shoots and are we seeing the use prompt? And if we were, then it would run this pickup logic, which, yeah, that would actually, that would probably not have worked properly. Because I don't know if that actually would have poured too much. It's been a long time since I looked at the code. But that code side of things, in terms of the ingredients, what happened there was we had this ingredient manager that would cycle periodically. It had the set of ingredients, so each one got a new set of sprites for it. So there were unique sprites that were unique combination of shapes and dots, so I could have enough ones there. And it would periodically cycle the recipe, and it looked at this penalty here, and that penalty determined what sort of that status text was that would appear on the monitor in terms of how things were going. And you needed to get, for these higher penalties, you kind of needed to actively be trying to get it wrong. So when it was actually being used, you'd get this add ingredient would run. So effort matches, and it updates the amount. We can see if it's still trying to actually add here more. So there was a penalty for too much of an ingredient. And there was also a penalty for if you applied the wrong ingredient. And these had different weightings. So you were penalized far more for applying an incorrect thing. You also got penalties for having an ingredient missing. So all of those contributed to adding the particular sort of penalties there, and to updating what the sort of status display was for these different indications of essentially how you were going. And when you went to add things to the different shoots, that was relatively sort of straightforward logic. And so how those were set up, if we go to our scenes and we go to the level, you can see everything's neatly stacked. So yes, we had our shoots here. So they were a cleanable item, and they also had this logic, and they would call the adding of the ingredient. And then, oops, not the cleanable item script, I want the shoot script. So yes, this would indicate sort of being it when you. This was definitely something where I used the same system because I was implementing this in a short period of time. The chutes were interactable items, and they had two interactions though, depending upon what key you pressed. So that determined whether this would do a primary activation or a secondary one. And so the amount you used would be determined by this. So it would either be a large or a small pore. And then it would just feed through the indication that an ingredient had been used. So that likely, when it would try to cough, I think, yeah, if it had a secondary item and it would show the use prompt, then I believe that would end up running this pickup, which would run did pickup, which was then, so yeah, that's why in terms of organization, the chain of how that things would flow through then is the game manager would make the decision to cough. The game manager would, through a Unity event, tell the interactable checker, and then the interactable checker would tell the chute that it had picked up and that it had picked up, that it had been picked up, and it would pick up essentially the large amount. So it's really not a great architecture for it. It was one where I built the interactable system for, like you can clearly see, I built the interactable system first for the barrels without considering what I was going to be doing with the chutes. And so I repurposed it for that. And so then it's held together in, I would say it would be very fair to call it spaghetti fashion. It's definitely not a great way of structuring it. So this is thankfully a much older game. It's from quite a few years ago now. But it is a good example of areas where what it's doing, the architecture is not good. How I would definitely be structuring it these days is game manager, keeping track of phases, keeping track of state. Yes, absolutely. The dirt manager itself, I would probably have that be keeping track of whether you're likely to cough. I would also probably do that so that it is area based, so that the room is divided into different zones. So if you just really clean one area and go to another area, then that other area might be dirty, then you're more likely to cough in that dirty area. So I would do stuff like of that. My interactable system, I would make it more generic. And with the chutes and that coughing having negative effects there, I would actually have something more like a trigger volume around the chute. And if you are within that trigger volume and cough gets triggered, then what happens is then it actually applies the entire thing into the manufacturing. So I think that sort of cleaning up that structure, making ownership and responsibilities there within it clearer would be sort of some of the big changes that I would make if I was doing this again in future. I think that would really help with making it easier and more manageable to work with. In general, I was happy with how a lot of the stuff worked, but I definitely think it could be significantly better. Now the shader, don't know if it's going to actually, how well it's actually going to show me it. Well, so the shader, this is implemented in Amplify Shader Editor, so it's one where I won't be including this in the files, and obviously I can't include Amplify Shader Editor, but I can show you the structure of how it worked, because I think that's useful. So it, coming in, had general stuff here in terms of had our base sort of textures. It had these blend ones with the dirt. And what it was doing here was based upon the dirtiness that came through. That's weird, that being destiny rather than destination. Okay, interesting. So what it would do is just bring in the different textures, apply sort of the necessary transformations so they appear at the correct locations, and then it would take those and just blend those in together. So the dirt blend got blended with this dirt texture. So using that mix of the dirt texture and the dirt blend gave a bit of a nicer appearance. This base dirt texture was a little, too sort of, filled out and uniform. I wanted something that was a bit messier, so that having that bit of extra messiness sort of helped with that, and just blended them together. And that just got fed through for the particular objects. It was quite a straightforward shader. There wasn't really a lot to it. So it'd be very easy to recreate this in shader graph, or just directly in code as a shader if you wanted to. It wasn't anything too complicated to it. So with these screens here, you'll notice that there is actually dirt appearing over the top of the interface there. So these screens, if we actually take a look, and I've shown this for other tutorials on how to do this, those screens, we have these virtual stages set up. And so those stages are each capturing to a render texture, and then that render texture is being applied to the screen section of that mesh. So I have the housing around it, and then the actual screen mesh. So that allowed me to have this, because if you're in an environment and everything was really covered in dirt, but the screen and only the screen was super clean, that just wouldn't have looked good. So I wanted to make it so that it was actually getting that dirt applied to it as well. So that worked out quite nicely with using those stages. And as I said, I do have some tutorials up on how to do things like this, if you're wanting to create something like that in any of your own games. But that's basically it for the game. Had a lot of mechanical aspects and things like that I quite liked. I think if I was from a design aspect, the one big change I would have made is I would have, if there'd been time, I wanted to have that result of however you did with manufacturing the things. I would have liked to see, sort of a conveyor line coming out of the factory of particular things that had been made, and depending upon how well you had actually done, that would determine whether those things looked like they were in pristine condition or whether they looked just like a chaotic mess. But that was something that, because I was building this under a constraint of a total of 24 development hours on it, there just wasn't that time for it. It was part of the original plan, but did end up having to be cut. But it was a lot of fun to be making it, and it was kind of an interesting one to experiment with, and got to learn a bunch of new things for actually making it, which was a big part of the goal with it. But I'm going to make a bunch of the code for this available, so you are welcome to check out that code. Now that it's not going to be the full project, it's only going to be sections of the code, because the full project includes some third-party assets that I don't have the license to distribute. So there will be some sections of the code where you'll see it calling things that aren't actually going to be present. That's just sort of an unavoidable thing because it is code directly taken from the actual game. But you're welcome to dive on in and take a look at any of the things there in terms of the setup for that. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, check out a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code, that code is available via a link in the description below. If you have any questions, chuck those in a comment. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description as well. But until next time,